Tunisia, March 1943. The rain had turned the road into sludge. A German Opel Blitz truck sat jackknifed in a ditch, one wheel spinning uselessly in the mud. A squad of Wehrmacht engineers shouted over the whine of the wind, trying to pry the axle loose with steel rods. Every minute lost meant fuel undelivered, artillery waiting, and front lines thinning. Then came the sound. A low growl, steady, not heavy like a tank, not screeching like a motorbike. A jeep crested the hill, open top, canvas flapping. American stars stenciled on the hood. 2 GIs inside, faces covered in dust and grins. They didn't stop. They didn't slow. They waved and drove straight through the mud. No chains, no crew, no hesitation. The Germans laughed. At first, they called it a toy, a tractor for farmers, a weak link in American armor. But weeks later, as more jeeps appeared on every ridge, every ravine, every village road, delivering troops, pulling wounded, relaying messages faster than any command car, the laughter faded. And by the time the war turned, and the tide followed it, the Germans weren't laughing anymore. They were outpaced by 4 wheels and a flat grille. In the early years of World War II, Germany's war machine was a study in armored precision. Blitzkrieg doctrine was built around speed, but not agility. Columns of panzer tanks, half-tracks, and motorcycles with sidecars dominated their advance through Poland, France, and into the Soviet Union. German generals relied on horse-drawn supply wagons for over 70% of their logistical support, but for forward units, they trusted big machines, heavy, mechanical, centralized. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States Army wasn't even ready. In 1939, America had fewer than 500,000 troops and no standard light reconnaissance vehicle. Cavalry was still on the books. Some officers suggested using motorcycles with sidecars for reconnaissance. Others preferred light trucks, but they broke down in rough terrain. What the Army needed, desperately, was something new, something nimble, something simple, something rugged enough to carry weapons, men, and messages through terrain that had no roads at all. So, in June 1940, as Hitler's forces swept across Europe, the U.S. Army issued a challenge to American automakers. Build us a 4-wheel drive, quarter-ton, all-terrain vehicle. It must be able to carry 600 pounds of equipment or soldiers. It must climb 30-degree slopes. It must weigh no more than 1,300 pounds. It must be delivered in 49 days. Only 3 companies answered: Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. Bantam, a small and struggling company from Pennsylvania, delivered the first prototype, the Bantam reconnaissance car, in just over 6 weeks. It was crude, underpowered, but met most specs. However, the Army feared Bantam was too small to mass produce. That's when Willys Overland stepped in. They took Bantam's design, improved it, and added the now legendary Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower workhorse that gave the vehicle surprising torques and power. It could climb, crawl, and cut through terrain no truck could manage. Ford, never one to miss a wartime contract, joined the competition with its own GP model, short for Government 80-inch Wheelbase, Passenger. But in the end, the War Department saw the writing on the wall. No one company had the production scale to meet the global demand that was coming. So, they made a historic decision. The Willys MB design would become standard, and both Willys and Ford would manufacture it together. Thus was born one of the most iconic military vehicles in history, the Jeep. The name itself remains debated. Some say it came from the Ford GP designation, pronounced Jeep. Others say it came from Eugene the Jeep, a magical creature from Popeye cartoons, small, smart, and able to go anywhere. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. And by late 1941, the Jeep was being shipped to Africa, Britain, Australia, and China before American troops had even entered combat in large numbers. What began as a stopgap design to replace horses and motorcycles was about to reshape the way America fought a global war. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Jeep was already in motion. Factories in Toledo, Ohio, and Dearborn, Michigan had begun turning out thousands of units each month. Willys Overland stamped its models MB, while Ford produced identical copies marked GPW. Despite rivalries, both followed the same blueprints. Parts were interchangeable, and the vehicles were built to military specifications, not style, not comfort, just purpose. And their purpose was clear. Go anywhere, carry anything, survive everything. The Jeep had no doors, no roof. The windshield folded down. It could be disassembled quickly, shipped in crates, or slung under gliders. At 2,000 pounds, it was light enough for 2 soldiers to push, but sturdy enough to haul a .30 caliber machine gun, an anti-tank weapon, or stretchers full of wounded men. Within months, it became the most visible American vehicle on every front. In North Africa, it zipped through sand while German trucks bogged down. In the jungles of Burma, it carved paths through brush and mud where tracks failed. On Italian mountain trails, it outpaced motorcycles. And when the Allies landed in Normandy, the Jeep was one of the first vehicles to roll off the beachhead. It wasn't just mobility, it was versatility. The Jeep served as scout car, field ambulance, wire-laying vehicle, radio communications hub, anti-tank platform with recoilless rifles or bazookas, general officer transport, forward observation post. It even towed artillery pieces, despite being no larger than a modern compact SUV. But what won over the soldiers wasn't just what the Jeep could do, it was how the Jeep never quit. Anecdotes flooded back to command. Jeeps climbing goat trails, Jeeps crossing rivers with snorkels attached, Jeeps running on 3 wheels, their 4th shattered by shrapnel. Mechanics loved it, crews trusted it. For soldiers trudging through mud or carrying 60-pound packs, the Jeep wasn't a vehicle, it was salvation. Even General Eisenhower would later say, "America could not have won the war without it." And yet, while American troops came to see the Jeep as an extension of their unit, many German officers continued to dismiss it. To the Wehrmacht's top brass, it looked too small, too soft, too low to the ground. German recon units rode motorcycles or used light armored cars, both faster on roads but hopeless off them. Their supply trucks needed maintenance. Their vehicles required bridging units for streams the Jeep could wade through. In 1942 and 1943, German reports still referred to the Jeep as a light terrain car, barely worth noting. But the tide of war was changing, and the Jeep was showing up everywhere. In captured German photos, it appears more frequently than any tank, any half-track, or any artillery piece. Not because it was the most powerful, but because it was the most present. It wasn't there to conquer ground. It was there to keep the army moving. To the average American GI, the Jeep wasn't just a tool, it was a lifeline. In the field, everything depended on movement, messages, medics, ammunition, food. You couldn't afford to wait for trucks or tanks. You needed something that started every time, handled like a mule, and asked for nothing in return. The Jeep delivered. Soldiers nicknamed it the Blitz Buggy, Peep, or simply the Jeep. They rode it into battle. They mounted machine guns on its hood. They strapped stretchers across its seats. They used it to haul crates of ammo, drums of fuel, radios, wire spools, and when the Jeep finally broke, they fixed it on the spot. 1 wrench, 1 socket, no drama. You could dig a Jeep out of mud in minutes, tow it with another Jeep, flip it upright with 5 men and a rope. In jungle terrain, it could slip between trees where no German half-track could go. In freezing Belgium, it kept running when even tanks froze overnight. In the chaos of war, it was reliable, predictable, and present. Veterans would later say it was like having a dog that never disobeyed, loyal, scrappy, and always ready to go. It had no armor, no suspension comfort. But it had heart, and in war, heart meant trust. To the German officer corps, especially in the early years of the war, the American Jeep looked like a joke. It had none of the martial features prized in the Wehrmacht: no armored plating, no mounted cannon, no machine gun turrets. It was squat, stubby, exposed. Field reports dismissed it as zivilartig, civilian-like. They saw it as weak, a reflection of what they believed was a soft and mechanized American army. But that perception didn't last. By 1943, the Wehrmacht began to notice how damn many Jeeps there were. They were behind every front line, in front of every tank column, used by medics, engineers, recon units, officers. They kept reappearing, and often in places German vehicles couldn't reach. Captured Jeeps were routinely pressed into German service, repainted, repurposed. Some were sent to SS units, others used by paratroopers. But they could never replicate the scale or simplicity. The Germans had no equivalent vehicle. The closest counterpart, the Kübelwagen, designed by Ferdinand Porsche, had better road performance, but couldn't match the Jeep's climbing power, suspension, or adaptability. By the time the Allies advanced through France and into Germany, the Jeep had earned reluctant respect. No one was laughing anymore. Few machines in military history have received as much praise from high command as the Jeep. General George Patton called it one of the 3 most important weapons of the war, alongside the C-47 transport plane and the M1 Garand rifle. Patton's own columns in North Africa and Europe relied on Jeep scouts to spearhead advances and relay real-time intel from the front. General Omar Bradley spent most of his combat career in the open rear seat of a Jeep, bouncing from division to division, meeting troops, giving orders on the move. And General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, gave the Jeep his highest endorsement. The Jeep, the Dakota airplane, and the landing craft were the 3 tools that won the war. Why did the brass love it? Because it freed them from the map table. Commanders didn't have to sit in tents waiting for reports. They drove out, inspected positions, saw terrain firsthand. The Jeep became a command vehicle, not because of what it had, but because of what it enabled: mobility, initiative, and speed. In a war that demanded flexibility, the Jeep let leaders stay close to the fight, and ahead of the enemy. At first glance, the Jeep looked unimpressive. Boxy, bare, functional. But its strength lay in what it didn't have. There was no complex transmission, no delicate suspension, no onboard electronics to fail in the rain. Every element of the Jeep was designed for one thing: to survive field conditions with minimal support. It ran on a 4-cylinder Go Devil engine, compact, reliable, and surprisingly powerful. It could idle for hours, run on poor fuel, and still start the next morning in freezing conditions. Its 4x4 drive train, uncommon at the time, gave it unmatched traction. The short wheelbase allowed tight turns and high maneuverability in forests, rubble, or narrow mountain passes. And then came the engineering magic: standardization. Every bolt, nut, and panel was interchangeable. A mechanic trained on a Willys MB could repair a Ford GPW with no issue. Field crews could strip one Jeep for parts and revive another within hours. No special tools required. In short, the Jeep was not over-designed, it was undercomplicated. And in war, simple lasts longer. It was the rare vehicle that could be trusted by amateurs and veterans alike. A design so rugged that it did its job quietly, while other machines faltered in the noise. The Jeep wasn't built to fight head-on. It was built to get you there before the fight started, and to get you out if it turned against you. This mobility created tactical opportunities that commanders hadn't seen in prior wars. In reconnaissance, Jeeps replaced cavalry. Scouts could fan out, report terrain, enemy movements, or road conditions in real time. They didn't rely on radios alone. They used their eyes, then raced back through terrain where trucks would have stalled. In infantry support, Jeeps moved small squads into ambush positions or leapfrogged behind armor columns to deliver supplies. They were often the first vehicle to cross rivers, scale ridges, or enter towns. And in raids, jeeps became fearsome tools. British SAS and American OSS units strapped twin machine guns to their hoods and conducted deep raids behind German lines, fast, loud, and gone before the enemy could respond. In North Africa, long-range desert groups used jeeps to cross hundreds of miles of open desert, destroying airfields and depots before vanishing again. Even in the Pacific, on tight island trails, the jeep proved invaluable, bringing mortars and medics into terrain too rough for tanks or even pack animals. Tactically, it didn't dominate the battlefield. It just redefined its edges. 6. The logistics angle, mass-produced momentum. The true power of the jeep wasn't just in what it could do, but in how many could do it. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 640,000 jeeps. That's nearly one jeep for every 25 US soldiers deployed in the war. It was the most widely manufactured military vehicle of the conflict. Willys Overland and Ford churned them out side by side, using a shared design. Trucks loaded with jeeps rolled onto ships bound for every continent. Assembly crews in England, India, and Australia received crates of parts and instructions. Some models were even parachuted in or loaded into gliders. Allied forces, French, Polish, Canadian, Chinese, all received jeeps under Lend-Lease agreements. Soviet forces famously used them in urban combat and artillery spotting roles. The jeep became a symbol of American production capacity. It showed that the US wasn't just fighting with men, it was fighting with factories. Where German logistics buckled under weight, complexity, and bottlenecks, the jeep represented flexibility. If one failed, a replacement was only days away. If terrain blocked tanks, jeeps adapted. If roads were destroyed, they forged new paths. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't armored, but it got there, and in war, that made all the difference. Normandy, June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the beaches as smoke mingled with mist. Steel hedgehogs jutted from the surf. Landing craft doors dropped. Men surged forward into water, sand, and gunfire. The Allied invasion of Europe had begun. And with them, in the chaos of the largest amphibious assault in history, came the jeep, slung under gliders, driven off landing craft, rolled across makeshift causeways under sniper fire. The jeep wasn't an afterthought. It was an invasion essential. By mid-morning, they were already inland, racing along hedgerows, ferrying wounded, delivering ammo, carrying engineers toward bridges that had to be taken before nightfall. Photographs from D-Day show jeeps nose-deep in surf, wheels digging through sand, still pressing forward. The German commanders watching this from their bunkers didn't focus on the jeeps at first. They looked at the tanks, the destroyers, the bombers overhead. But what they failed to understand, what no one truly grasped until it was too late, was how fast the Allied force could move once it hit the ground. And the reason? Thousands of jeeps. They weren't just moving troops, they were establishing momentum. Within 48 hours of the beachhead, jeeps had helped lay down command posts, connected infantry to artillery, and opened routes for tanks to advance faster than expected. Messages no longer took hours to relay. Engineers no longer needed to carry tools by foot. Medics no longer ran through fire unassisted. The Germans began to realize the problem. The Americans were not only numerous, they were relentless. Unlike in 1940 France, where German forces had to pause to regroup, to bridge rivers, to refuel, the American advance never stopped. Day or night, over fields or rubble, through forest or fog, the jeeps kept moving. And with them, so did the war. In hedgerow country, where tanks couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead, jeeps led the way. Scouts marked trails, observers called in artillery fire from the front. Rifle squads hopped out, flanked enemy machine guns, then were picked up again and moved to the next fight. The German Wehrmacht, built around centralized columns and carefully orchestrated maneuvers, wasn't prepared for an enemy that flowed like water across fields, around obstacles, under air cover. In one captured after-action report, a German officer wrote, "The enemy is uncatchable. Their vehicles appear before we detect movement. They do not wait to fight in our terms." What he was describing wasn't a tank blitz, it was a mobility doctrine, enabled by the Jeep. The small machine that couldn't stop a bullet was now reshaping how the battlefield worked. By the fall of 1944, the Jeep had become more than a vehicle. It had become a tactical constant. In every major Allied offensive from Normandy to the Rhine, the Jeep was there, not behind the front lines, but threaded through them. During Operation Cobra, when the Allies finally broke through the Norman bocage, it wasn't just tanks that poured through the gap. It was waves of Jeeps, carrying officers, wire teams, medics, and mobile fire control crews. While Sherman tanks led the charge, the Jeep sustained it, keeping the entire machine of war running without pause. And as the Allied forces raced toward Paris, it was the Jeep that allowed commanders to keep up. While German officers still relied on radio dispatches or motorcycle couriers to receive updates, American and British commanders were physically on the battlefield, riding in Jeeps, issuing orders directly, moving with the advance, or redirecting fire support in person. Even the liberation of Paris was filled with them. Photos showed jubilant crowds swarming Allied Jeeps as they rolled down the Champs-Élysées, carrying grinning infantrymen, photographers, and French resistance liaisons. But the Jeep's moment of vindication came not from fanfare, but from fatigue. As German forces began to collapse, retreating through the Ardennes and across the Rhine, they were pursued not only by tanks and aircraft, but by Jeeps. Small recon units outpaced retreating columns, blocked bridges, relayed artillery coordinates faster than German units could regroup. Light and unrelenting, they were the advance eyes and ears of a massive war machine. Even during the Battle of the Bulge, where weather grounded air support and roads froze under snow, Jeeps continued to crawl forward, wrapped in blankets, dragging trailers, hauling 80mm mortars or stretcher teams. They proved not just rugged, but adaptable to extreme cold, deep mud, and forest fighting. In Burma, Jeeps crossed jungle terrain once deemed impassable. With no roads, they were winched across rivers, rolled over bamboo bridges, and converted into makeshift ambulances for wounded Gurkhas and Chindit fighters. In Italy, they scaled alpine switchbacks under fire. In the Philippines, they navigated flooded plains. Even in the final assault on Germany, Jeeps were first into the towns, carrying MPs, medics, and MAP teams into places where tanks would bog down. And when the war ended, the most common American vehicle seen in liberated cities across Europe and Asia wasn't a Sherman or a Mustang. It was a Jeep. Captured German generals, in post-war interrogations, were often asked about what surprised them most about the American war effort. Some mentioned logistics. Others mentioned code-breaking. But one name came up more than expected: the Jeep. Not because it was fast, not because it was armored, but because it was everywhere, and it never seemed to stop. A machine that required no special attention, could function in nearly any climate, and enabled the Allies to stretch supply lines farther and faster than any previous army in modern warfare. It defied the assumptions of German doctrine, which prized central control, roads, and fuel-efficient logistics. The Jeep didn't care about any of that. It just moved, forward, sideways, through mud, sand, or ruins. And in doing so, it became the symbol of American momentum. When the war ended in 1945, Europe and the Pacific lay in ruins. Cities bombed flat, railways twisted, roads cratered. But among the rubble, one shape remained familiar: the Jeep. It had survived not just combat, but every terrain imaginable: deserts, jungles, mountain passes, beaches, swamps, and snow. It had served as a gun mount, ambulance, radio post, and food truck. It had pulled artillery, ferried generals, and carried refugees. It had become the most adaptable object in the Allied arsenal. And it didn't stop with victory. In occupied Germany and Japan, jeeps were used by Allied occupation forces, relief agencies, and engineers rebuilding infrastructure. The UN and Red Cross adopted them for humanitarian work. Photographers documented liberation and reconstruction from the same open-air seats where riflemen once rode into war. The military knew they had created something they could never retire. So they didn't. The Jeep became standard issue for NATO and US forces during the early Cold War, in Korea, in Greece, in the newly formed West German Army. From 1945 through the 1960s, variations of the wartime Jeep model were adapted, improved, and exported. But what surprised even the Pentagon was how deeply the Jeep entered civilian life. In 1945, Willys Overland released the CJ-2A, the first civilian Jeep. Farmers snapped them up. Ranchers, loggers, forest rangers, oil crews. It could plow snow, tow a trailer, and go places no truck could reach. The vehicle designed for war became a symbol of American freedom and utility. Across the globe, surplus Jeeps flooded markets. You could find them in Colombia, New Zealand, Kenya, Burma. In some places they became taxis, in others, mail carriers. Mechanics began rebuilding them from scrap, turning war machines into post-war tools of survival and trade. Even today, original World War II Jeeps are restored, collected, and displayed in military parades and museums. And the design never fully disappeared. Modern military vehicles, from the HMMWV to Special Forces light trucks, still bear the DNA of that original 1940 blueprint: small, simple, all-terrain, unstoppable. The Germans had laughed at the Jeep, but history didn't. It elevated it from utility vehicle to mechanical legend. In the years that followed the war, the Jeep's legacy extended beyond mud and memories. Military historians, tacticians, and industrial analysts began to revisit its role, not just as a vehicle, but as a concept. What the Jeep represented was revolutionary. Mobility as a strategy, not a byproduct. Before World War II, armies had measured power in divisions, guns, and tonnage. But the Jeep proved that war wasn't just about what you could deploy. It was about how quickly you could react, how rapidly you could connect units, how nimbly you could adapt to terrain. It wasn't just about force, it was about flow. The Wehrmacht had leaned on speed through Blitzkrieg, but it required precise timing, mechanized divisions, and heavy fuel demands. When that timing broke down, the entire system faltered. The Allies, on the other hand, created a modular mobility force. Smaller units, lightly equipped, able to respond quickly, flank easily, supply flexibly. And the Jeep was the backbone of that doctrine. It gave commanders the ability to see in real time, to lead from the front, to shift tactics not by the hour, but by the minute. For America, it also became a symbol of industrial identity. It showed that the US didn't just manufacture weapons, it designed machines that could be produced fast, shipped anywhere, and repaired by anyone. Even the Jeep's success helped define future procurement logic. Simplicity over complexity, interchangeable parts, cross-platform production. These became tenets of post-war military design. And beyond the battlefield, the Jeep became cultural shorthand. In Hollywood, the image of a dusty Jeep crossing a war-torn landscape, GIs waving from the back, dust clouds behind them, became a symbol of Allied victory, determination, and resolve. War correspondents rode in them. Presidents sat in them. Parades rolled them through Main Street. Across the world, civilians who had never seen a tank or bomber knew what a Jeep was. It wasn't a threat. It was a sign that help had arrived. Today, the Jeep remains in active duty in symbolic form, at memorials, in museums, in reenactments. But its real echo lies in doctrine, in how modern armies think about maneuver warfare, modular logistics, and decentralized command mobility. All of that, in many ways, started with 4 wheels, a flat hood, and a war no one expected it to win. The Jeep was never designed to inspire awe. It didn't thunder like a tank or soar like a fighter plane. It didn't fire a shell or drop a bomb. It didn't break front lines or decide campaigns on its own, but it never needed to. Because what it gave, every hour, every mile, every hill, was momentum. It moved faster than bureaucracy, climbed further than doctrine, and reached deeper into the front than any general expected. It carried the wounded, the orders, the messages, the hope. It didn't win the war by force. It won it by showing up again and again on every road, in every terrain, under every sky. And while German generals once laughed at its humble frame and unarmored shell, history had the final word. It wasn't the machine that looked strong that shaped the war. It was the machine that never stopped moving. The Jeep was never meant to be a legend. It became one anyway.